A disadvantage is exactly what it sounds like. It's an undesirable and often unintended consequence of implementing the affirmative plan. If the judge votes affirmative and the plan is implemented, a disadvantage is the bad thing that will happen as a result of voting affirmative. These disadvantages may or may not outweigh or be more persuasive than the advantages introduced by the affirmative team. But a disadvantage is among the most powerful tools used by the negative team to convince the judge that the affirmative plan is simply a bad idea. Now, while the concept of a disadvantage is easy to understand, the specific structure of a disadvantage is a little bit more complex. It has multiple parts and it requires several pieces of evidence. In the debate round, affirmative teams rarely offer plans that directly cause disadvantages. They're way smarter than that. So you won't see affirmative plans that directly result in global warming, crash the economy, or lead to nuclear war. Instead, negative teams will need to prove that affirmative plans indirectly lead to these things. That's why disadvantages require multiple parts and multiple pieces of evidence. To make things a little easier, I'd like to offer a couple examples of disadvantages during this video. The first is an example that you wouldn't see in a debate round, but you might see in your daily life. The second and third examples are disads you might use in debate rounds. I'll describe all three first, and then we'll break each of them down into their basic parts. Example number one is this. Let's say the government mandated that no unhealthy products could be sold in the vending machines in your high school. Now, as a student, you might argue that this will cause a significant drop in the revenue from the vending machines because students prefer sugary drinks and unhealthy snacks, and since the school uses that money to pay for prom, the government mandate may cause prom to be canceled this year. We call this example the prom example, and the thesis of the dissent is that passing the affirmative plan to eliminate unhealthy vending machine snacks and drinks will cause prom to be canceled. Now, here's example number two. Let's say that the affirmative plan required the federal government to spend $20 billion, and that's a lot of money, even for Uncle Sam. As the negative team, you could argue that passing the plan would require the government to cut funding from some other program in order to pay for the affirmative plan. These other programs could include things like cancer research, public education, or reducing teenage smoking. You'd have to have the evidence to prove that, of course, but the evidence isn't that hard to find. This is called a trade-off disadvantage, and the thesis of this disadvantage is that the affirmative plan causes money to be cut from important programs, which means that no matter how wonderful the affirmative plan might be, paying for the affirmative plan would indirectly result in a rise in cancer, a decrease in public education, or an increase in teenage smoking, for example. Example number three. The third disadvantage we'll talk about is a politics disadvantage. The thesis of the politics disadvantage is that passing an affirmative plan weakens one political party and prevents them from passing legislation in the future that's much more important. Let's say, for example, that the affirmative team proposes a plan to reduce military surveillance. Now, the Democrats would probably favor that plan, and the Republicans would probably oppose that plan. But let's say that through some sort of favors and arm twisting, that the Democrats won, and the affirmative plan would reduce military surveillance. That's a big win for the Democrats. Fast forward 6 months down the road to the next big bill, which is a big health care bill, favored by the Democrats and opposed by the Republicans. Now the Democrats don't have enough political strength to pass the health care bill because they used up all of their favors and arm twisting to pass the military bill. As a result, the negative team argues that passing the affirmative plan will kill the health care bill, and lots of bad things will happen as a result of killing the health care bill. Okay, those are our three examples: the prom disadvantage, the trade-off disadvantage, and the politics disadvantage. Now let's look at four parts of a disadvantage: uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact. We'll analyze each part one at a time to see how they work with each of the three example disadvantages. The first part of a disadvantage is uniqueness. The first thing the negative team must prove is that this disadvantage isn't going to happen unless the affirmative plan is passed. In other words, the negative team must prove that things are going well now. In the prom example, the negative team would have to prove and provide evidence to show that the amount of money currently being put into the vending machines is enough to pay for prom. In the trade-off example, the negative team would have to prove and provide evidence that the federal government will soon invest in lots of money in things like cancer research, for example. And in the politics example, the negative team would have to provide evidence that the Democrats are probably going to pass the health care bill. If the negative team fails to prove that the status quo is happy and on track, it would be much harder to prove that the affirmative plan uniquely triggers the disadvantage. And that's why we call it uniqueness. The affirmative plan is unique because it's the only thing that will cause the disadvantage to happen. On to the second part of the disadvantage, the link. A link connects the affirmative plan to the disadvantage. Regardless of whether you titled your first piece of evidence a brink or uniqueness, you will need evidence that links the affirmative plan to the rest of the disadvantage. If this were a courtroom, a link would be the evidence that connects the defendant to the crime. In the debate world, the link is established by reading evidence that claims a particular action taken by the affirmative plan would trigger an undesirable set of outcomes. Using our prom example, the link is established by claiming that removing junk food from the vending machines would be the reason why vending machine sales plummet. In our trade-off example, the link is established by providing evidence that passing the affirmative plan would cause the government to pay for the plan using money set aside for cancer research. In our politics example, the link is established by providing evidence that passing the military surveillance bill would cause the Republicans to vote against the health care bill. Note that in all three examples, it is the affirmative plan that triggers the undesirable outcome. So the link becomes a way for the negative team to blame the affirmative plan for the bad things that would happen if the plan were passed. Now, in the world of debate, there are two types of links, generic and specific. And the difference is whether the evidence describes a generic action that could include the affirmative plan or a specific action that only includes the affirmative plan. A generic link might contend that any drop in school revenue would cancel the prom, or that any increase in government spending that would threaten cancer funding, or that any bill passed by the Democrats would threaten the health care bill. A specific link might claim that removing junk food from the vending machines would cancel prom, or that spending money on the specific affirmative plan would threaten cancer funding directly, or that passing the military surveillance bill would threaten the health care bill specifically. Now, a specific link is always preferred over generic link, but evidence that specifically links the affirmative plan to the disadvantage can be very hard to find. The more generic the link is, the more likely a judge is to dismiss the link. After all, almost every affirmative plan spends money or passes a bill, so introducing a disadvantage that links to literally every possible affirmative plan is less strategically smart than introducing a disadvantage that specifically links the affirmative plan. Good negative teams usually have both types of links ready to use. If they have specific links, they'll mention the affirmative plan, they'll use those. If they don't have those links available in their files, they will either skip the disadvantage or they will just read the generic links. Now, thus far in our disadvantage, we've proven that the status quo is either healthy or on the brink of failure. We've also proven that the affirmative plan is to blame for triggering what happens next. So now let's talk about the next part of the disadvantage, the internal link. Now, the internal link is the only part of the disadvantage that is optional. And by optional, I don't mean that you just can choose to skip it if you don't like it. What I mean by optional is that I mean that some disadvantages don't require an internal link logically because the connection between the link and the undesirable outcome is direct. An internal link is the why or the how that explains the connection between the link and the undesirable outcome, called the impact. Some people like to explain the internal link as an additional step, but it's rarely that, and in most cases in just disadvantages. So let's use our examples to see why. In the prom example, you want to prove that reducing vending machine sales will cancel prom. But you need to prove why or how this is true with evidence. Maybe it's true because prom is paid for by vending machine sales. Or maybe it's true because your principal has said in the past that vending machine sales impacts prom. In trade-off examples, you want to prove that passing the affirmative plan will reduce cancer funding. But you will need to prove how or why this is true. Maybe it's true because the House Majority Leader is quoted as saying that the government has to choose between additional spending and cancer research. Maybe it's true because there's a group of senators trying to find any excuse to cut medical research funding, and that includes cancer funding. In the politics example, you want to prove that passing this affirmative plan will threaten the most important bill in the future. But you'll need to prove why or how this is true. Maybe it's true because the Republicans have stated publicly that they aren't going to give the Democrats anything they want. Or maybe it's true because the Republican Speaker of the House is on record saying that his or her support for the health care bill is at best shaky, but right now he or she will vote for it. So an internal link isn't really an extra step. It's not A causes B, which causes C. An internal link is the evidence that explains how or why A causes C. I mentioned earlier that internal links are sometimes optional, and this is true when no explanation is needed. And it's rare that a team wouldn't need to explain why or how. So your best strategy when building a disadvantage is to assume that the internal link is always needed. And if you decide not to use an internal link, be prepared to explain why. And now we've come to the last piece of the disadvantage, the impact. The impact is the undesirable outcome that is always going to be worse than any benefit derived from the affirmative plan. Some impacts are huge and horrible, like nuclear war, global warming, or pandemic disease. Other impacts are smaller and more realistic, like canceling prom, or an increase in cancer rates, or reduced healthcare funding for those who need it. Good negative teams will often have several scenarios, impact scenarios, that they can use depending on the judge in the back of the room. Judges who are very experienced in debate are often more willing to accept the hypothetical claim that the affirmative plan will lead to nuclear war. Other judges who have never seen a debate round might find it a little exaggerated and hard to believe that the affirmative plan leads to nuke war. So good negative teams walk into a tournament with both impacts ready to go, and they will decide during the prep time whether they want to claim that the affirmative plan leads to a huge and horrible impact or a small and realistic impact. The impact you choose is important because debate is a game in which both teams are trying to prove that passing the affirmative plan will or won't have major advantages or disadvantages. The affirmative team wants to prove that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, and the negative team wants to prove that the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. In order to do this, both teams they often want terminal impacts. Terminal impacts are always big and horrible. Extinction, war, disease, and famine. Negative teams want terminal impacts because no matter how wonderful the affirmative plan might be, terminal impacts are always worse. They always outweigh the benefits of the affirmative. So let's go back to our examples and see how that plays out. We'll look at 2 impact scenarios for each example. As we do, keep in mind that for the debate examples, trade-off in politics, you would want to be prepared to offer both impact scenarios, or at least choose the one that fits the judge in the back of the room. But let's start with prom. For a prom example, the impact could simply be canceling prom. That's pretty undesirable, but does it outweigh the benefits of a healthy school snack system? Probably not. So maybe we want an impact that's a little heftier. Maybe the canceling prom leads to a bigger impact than just canceling prom itself. You could argue that prom is a safe and supervised activity offered by the school, and canceling prom would lead to unsafe and unsupervised activities that could cost students their lives. This would be worse than the benefits of eating healthy, even if it was only one student who was hurt by an unsafe choice that could have been prevented. Now, if you wanted to make this argument, your link would claim that reducing vending machine money threatens to cancel prom. Your internal link would explain why prom is a supervised activity that keeps students safe, and your impact would explain that off-campus celebrations are more likely to lead to tragedies. For our trade-off example, the impact could simply be that cutting funding for cancer research would cause an increase in cancer rates. And that's already a really hefty impact. It might even outweigh any of the benefits of the affirmative plan. It's not likely that you would need a more terminal impact, but let's say you wanted something more powerful. Perhaps you could revisit your link, and instead of claiming that the affirmative plan threatens funding for cancer research, it threatens funding for the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, and is the government agency responsible for preventing or managing global pandemic outbreaks like Ebola or AIDS. You could now claim that cutting funding for the CDC could have terminal impacts such as global pandemics, which are of course going to be worse than any of the advantages claimed by the affirmative. For our politics example, the impact is that the health care bill doesn't get passed and millions of Americans don't get access to the health care they need. That's bad, of course, and it might be worse than the advantages claimed by the affirmative team. But let's take it a step further. What if we were able to demonstrate that an inefficient health care system was the biggest threat to our economy? And what if we could prove with evidence that failing to address our healthcare system would lead to a long-term global depression? That's really big, and it's probably worse than the advantages of the affirmative plan. Before we end today's video on disadvantages, there are 3 things that I want to quickly discuss: the thesis, the structure, and the impact calc. The thesis is the 1 or 2 sentence summary of your disadvantage, and is critical to the success of your disadvantage itself. Many negative teams make the poor choice not to read the thesis of the disadvantage, and it always hurts them, especially in front of inexperienced judges. So when you introduce a disadvantage into the round, take a few seconds to explain the thesis of the disadvantage and summarize the main points of the disadvantage before you start reading all of your evidence. If judges understand the big picture before you start walking them through the individual steps, they are far more likely to understand each piece as it's read. The second item is structure. When you read a disadvantage in a debate round, you want to use the following structure. Provide the title of the disad as your next argument. Then read the 1 or 2 sentence thesis. You'll next want to say the word uniqueness or brink, then read your tagline, then your evidence. Take a moment at the end of your evidence to summarize the most important part of the evidence. Then say the word link, read your tagline, then the evidence, then summarize your evidence. Then say the words internal link, read your tagline, read the evidence, then summarize your evidence. Then say the word impact, read your tagline, then the evidence, then summarize your evidence. Then take a few seconds to explain that thesis again and summarize the entire disadvantage. Many negative teams, especially the more advanced teams, skip the labels for each part of the disadvantage, and they often skip the summarizations. In all my years of coaching, I've never met a judge who has been upset with the team for providing these extra elements. But I've sure met a lot of judges, even highly experienced judges, who are bothered or confused when debaters don't take the few extra seconds to provide these helpful navigational tools. Finally, let's discuss impact calculus. Now, I'm only going to touch on this briefly because I explain it in much more detail in the video titled Answering Disadvantages. Impact calculus is defined as the comparison between the desirable impacts of the affirmative advantages to the undesirable impacts of the negative disadvantages. Whether you're affirmative or negative, you'll want to spend a lot of time, particularly in rebuttals, weighing the disadvantages to the advantages. Which is worse? Which impacts are greater? Why is the disadvantage worse than the advantage, or vice versa? In order to do this correctly, you need a few measuring sticks by which you compare them to. In the world of debate, there are 3 measuring sticks by which you might compare your impacts: time frame, probability, and magnitude. Time frame will compare impacts based on which happened first. Probability compares impacts based on which are more likely to happen. And magnitude compares impacts based on which impact is more undesirable or desirable. These 3 measuring sticks give debaters a great deal of flexibility when weighing arguments. The terribly scary disad that ends in global nuclear war might win the magnitude debate, but it probably isn't going to win the time frame or probability debate. So when you're arguing disads, don't just focus on which team prevents the biggest body count. Take the time to explore the full range of possibilities. Okay, that's it for disads. Take a moment to review the major terms, and don't forget to watch the video titled Answering Disads. Disadvantage, thesis, uniqueness, brink, link, internal link, impact, impact calculus, time frame, magnitude, and probability. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.